Thank you all for coming. I'm Taylor Jaworski. I'm an economics professor in the economics department here at University of Colorado. I would first like to thank the Center for Western Civilization, Thought and Policy, and in particular Alex Holmgren for helping organize this event. So I'm here today just to introduce our speaker and then get going with that. And he'll talk for somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour and then turn it over to some people in the audience for questions. So our speaker today is Jared Rubin. He's a professor of economics at Chapman University in Southern California. He is the co-director of the Institute for Study of Religion, Economics, and Society at Chapman. He received his PhD in economics from Stanford in 2007. And he's here today to talk to us about sort of his long-standing interest in the economic history of Europe and the Middle East, sort of the intersection of those things, and the economics of religion, so how we can use economics to study and understand religion and the role of religion in society. He's going to talk to us specifically about the book, which you can see here, and you can buy on Amazon if you're so inclined, Rulers, Religion, and Riches. The book is the winner of a Best Book Prize from the Society of Institutional and Organizational Economics. And sort of like all good economic historians, the book, or Jared's book, is about sort of what makes societies successful, you might say rich, or not successful, or not rich. But I think sort of more importantly, the book is also about some other things. It's about sort of the sources of political legitimacy, what gives people the right to rule, or gives them the legitimacy to rule. And then an important question for today is, what are the institutional requirements to having a well-functioning economy? So hopefully Jared will have some insight into that. I think he will. Please join me in welcoming Jared Rubin.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank you to the center for having me. This is really cool, and thank you for plugging the book. So this book came out last year, and as Taylor noted, it's culmination of about a decade or so, or even more, of research that went into one aspect of this really big question that's the subtitle of the book, why the West got rich and the Middle East did not. So I should preface by saying this book doesn't provide the answer. I think it provides an answer that's one of many that's kind of an understudied, but the answer, as you will see as I discuss some of the insights of the book, is one that I think a lot of you, even if you don't know much about the history of the region, or if you do, will have some thoughts on. What role does religion play in economic outcomes? What role does politics play in economic outcomes? What role does the confluence of those two things play in economic outcomes? That's really, as Taylor mentioned, what the book is about. And it's particularly about tracing out some of the unintended and unforeseeable consequences of different types of arrangements for ruling societies. So it traces through how we should think about how politics affects economic outcomes and what role religion plays in that. But before I discuss the book itself, I wanted to talk to you about some advance praise that the book got, because it's important to show that the book was successful. And this was awesome. I got this comment, and I thought, wow, I've really achieved something here. Now, it doesn't matter who said it, but it's one of those things, it's nice to hear. I did get some criticism as well from my daughter, who is not into Daddy's works yet. Hopefully one of these days she will be. But anyway, the question of why the West got rich and the Middle East did not is not one that's obvious, at least to those who really kind of know the history of these two regions. So this isn't something that has always been preordained by any means. And I should say, my book focuses on the West the West being really Western Europe and its offshoots versus the Middle East. But the same questions have been discussed by others and could be, and I believe a similar framework that I propose here, could be used for saying the West versus China, the West versus South Asia. My research focuses on the Middle East. That's why I kind of focus on it more so here. But I also think there's other reasons for studying the Middle East vis-a-vis Western Europe. There's, for one, it's much closer. They share way more cultural background, similar Abrahamic faiths, things like this, that do make it a little more of a puzzle. Moreover, it's also, very clearly a puzzle why the West got rich first relative to the Middle East, because it was not always this way. So circa, say, certainly 800, and almost certainly the year 1000, most Middle Eastern societies were well ahead of Western Europe on almost any type of metric you could think of, economically, technologically, by almost any metric of culture. This was, they call it the Dark Ages in Europe for a variety of reasons, but this was not, Europe's high mark by any means, and it was one of the high marks of the Middle East, especially relative to the rest of the world. And this point's relatively undisputed by historians. So one way you can see this, there's a variety of ways that you might test whether, what society's doing better at any one given point in time. One way that historians and economic historians have attempted to do this for the pre-industrial period is look at population size, particularly city size. The idea being that in a pre-modern economy, one of the ideas being that having big cities is an indication of wealth. Cities, for one, you had to have enough surplus in the countryside to feed the urbanites who weren't producing food. Also, cities were where the luxuries were generally produced, life, and where you had bigger cities, you also had new problems that had to be solved, political problems, infrastructure problems. All of this required more wealth. So one way to look at this is to look at when we're comparing what we might call the quote-unquote Islamic world versus quote-unquote Christian world, is to just get a general view of where the population was. So the darkened in dots there are cities that in the year 800, and this is really, I think, one of the high water marks in terms of the Islamic world versus Western Europe, versus the Christian West. So these are the 20, or I think in this case, 22 most populous cities in all of the Middle East and North Africa. As you can see, there's a lot of dark dots here. And this even hides one of the big points, namely that Baghdad, which was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, which was the major political player in the Middle East at this time, was more populous than the 12 most populous Christian cities of Western Europe at the time. So the idea being that, certainly as of 800, by one of the most well-known metrics that we have, the Middle East, or you might say the Islamic world more generally, is doing much better than Western Europe. We also know that at some point this changed. It's also, it's undisputed that certainly the Industrial Revolution happened in England. Northwestern Europe more generally is where the modern economy really first emerged. Now, at what point, we're crossing paths is up for debate, and that's not a debate that I enter into in this book. In fact, I don't really think it matters much exactly when it happened, but it certainly did happen. So understanding this reversal of fortunes, why it happened, is not just a question of historical interest. It's a question of understanding where modern wealth comes from, where the modern economy comes from, the underpinnings, whether they be political, economic, social, religious, that at least at one period in time help spur on modern growth in one part of the world. And understanding why modern growth first happened in one part of the world, the counter to that question, I think, is equally as interesting and possibly even more interesting. Why didn't it happen in other regions, especially those parts of the world that were ahead at a previous point in time? So we can see this by, just very, this isn't meant to substantiate any points or something. This is just meant to kind of motivate this idea. So by 1300, the tide was turning a little bit. So very, very brief historical background here. The year approximately 1000, or somewhere in the 10th century up through about 1300, is what historians call the commercial revolution in parts of Europe, where Europe kind of starts to reawaken after centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. And commerce really starts to reemerge in northern Italy. You can see some of the more populated cities here are in northern Italy and the Low Countries, even though the Low Countries just have a lot of cities and not necessarily overly populous ones. And now if we look to 1800, which is, after England has started to industrialize, but really it's kind of on the precipice of the major economic expansion of the 19th century in Europe, the reversal of fortunes is complete by this point. So this is the 20 most populous cities, Western Eurasia, really, the Middle East and North Africa, and they're almost all European. There's a few cities that are still large, of course, in the Middle East. But by this point, the reversal of fortunes is complete. Again, the point of this talk, the point of this book is not to pinpoint what year this happened or even which century this happened, but it's to understand what happened, especially between this period, 800 and 1800. And so what I do in this book, and what I've been doing for about a good third of my life, is thinking through a framework for understanding how politics affects religion, how religion affects politics, and what that means for economic outcomes, and then applying it to this puzzle. All right, so what I'll do here is I'll take you pretty quickly through the framework, and then I'm going to show how some of the applications of the framework, how they apply to some kind of unintended, kind of unforeseeable historical events. All right. Oh, so this is just one more idea here that I had was to plot the urban center of gravity, which is just yet another metric that we can think about. It's kind of where people were. We weight them by where they are around the Middle East and North Africa. And I've blown it up here. What you can see is it's moving from the Middle East essentially up to northwestern Europe. And so one other thing that I think is important to note here is that I've been framing this as the West, or even Western Europe versus the Middle East, but it's not really even Western Europe, it's Northwestern Europe. In particular, it's really England and to some extent the Dutch Republic and what would become the Netherlands. The rest of Europe was relatively slow to catch up, and some parts were really slow to catch up, especially Southern Europe. Spain and Italy remained poor for quite some time, and actually by some metrics aren't even that clearly that far ahead of many parts of the Middle East as late as the mid-19th century. All right, so this is what this book does. It asks what I think is a pretty provocative question that you might have some ideas on, and I'm not here to actually even tell you your ideas are wrong by any means if they don't agree with what I say here, but I do provide an explanation for thinking about this because the huge elephant in the room in all of this, of course, is you have two religions that dominate these two areas, and as social scientists, as academics, even if it's an uncomfortable question to ask, it doesn't mean it's not a question we shouldn't ask. Because maybe the religion did play something in this divergence. So you'll see here what I am basing this framework on, which and I believe I've given a lot of evidence to support it, has very little, almost really practically nothing to do with the content of the two religions, the doctrine of Islam or the doctrine of Christianity. There will be one point at which one of the doctrines is important. I'll say what that is in a few minutes here. But I do want to make this clear from the get-go, just so if you have very strong preconceived notions one way or the other, I'm not saying it's actually something about Islam or something about something bad about Islam or something good about Christianity that led to this divergence. What I am going to say, though, is that it's about the role that they play in politics that does matter for economic outcomes. And they do play different roles for historic reasons that I will very briefly discuss. All right, so this slide will give you one chapter in one slide, really like 5 years of my life in one slide. All right, so what I do is, so as an economist, I'm thinking through what we call a model, what you might, so I know there's some students in the room, we might think of a game theoretic framework, even though don't let that dissuade you from buying the book. There's no Greek letters. There's no math in the book. I wrote it actually so it can be assigned to undergrads, and I do assign it to my own undergrads, and they won't be scared from reading it. So what I do is I discuss how we should be thinking about what we'll call a game. That's purely an economics term. When we're thinking about interactions between various what I'll call elites in society here. So imagine you have a ruler. In a society. It doesn't necessarily have to be an individual. It can be a group. And it generally is going to be kind of what we might think of as a coalition of important people that surround the ruler. And by using the term ruler, what I'm really trying to do here is to create what we might think of as a general model or a general way of thinking about this that can apply to democracies, that can apply to monarchies, that can apply to autocracies. That we could apply. I'd like to think we can apply this framework to any type of polity, including modern ones. All right, so this term that I put up here, it's a little bit clunky, but it gets at how I want to think about this. Namely, rulers want to stay in power. They want to keep their power, and what I'm using here is propagation. They want to stay in power. Now, there are generally many things that rulers want. They might want money. They might just want power. They might want favors for their friends. All of these things that they want, they can't do unless they stay in power. How a ruler stays in power, why people follow what that ruler does, is not always obvious. So the question is, how do rulers stay in power? And that's one of the main pieces of the framework the questions that this framework attempts to answer. All right. So one way it does this, a ruler would do this, and one thing that is the outcome of staying in power, so really we could think of this arrow as even going both ways, is by putting forth laws and policies. All right. But that is far from the end of it. I mean, okay. So what? So a ruler declares something. Why should I follow what a ruler does? All right. So why would I follow what a ruler says? Why do I follow what a governor or the president puts forth, or Congress puts forth as a law? All right. So the key distinction I make here, and both historically and in the present, we can think about this certainly today as well, are two different concepts. One is much easier to discern than the other, so we'll discuss that first. The first one's coercion, or really the threat of coercion. The idea being here that if you have enough guns, or enough of whatever your technology is at the time, to coerce people to do things using either violence or the threat of violence, you can have people follow your laws. And when you think of warlords as using a lot of coercion, or again, it's really the threat of coercion to make people follow whatever it is they want, even if the people don't want to do what the ruler wants them to do. The other one's legitimacy, and this is a little fuzzier. And I think one reason that economists are now only starting to really talk about legitimacy, even though it's something that certainly sociologists and to some extent political scientists have been talking about much longer, is that it is a lot harder to quantify. And quantifying is not something I'd attempt to do in this book. Instead, I attempt to define it and think about what are some of the implications of it. So first, let's talk about what does that even legitimacy mean. You might have some thoughts, but I'll just tell you what mine are. My idea of legitimacy is, in terms specifically political legitimacy, is a ruler has legitimacy if people want to follow or believe that person is the rightful ruler, and thus they should follow him. And so it's kind of a moral concept. We might think of it as an intrinsic concept, and it also is one that we can think of it as on a scale. It's not that you either have legitimacy or you don't. It's that some rulers are more legitimate than others. All right, well, how do you get legitimacy? How do you even get coercion? It's not like rulers are actually going to be the ones that go out there and point the gun at you. There's generally going to be people in society that do this. All right, so now there's other people in society that are going to provide both coercion. We might think of as military, local police, militias, warlords, things like this. We'll call those coercive agents. More importantly, for the story of Western Europe and the Middle East, we're going to talk about people that provide legitimacy. These are people that can alter the beliefs of other people about that person's right to rule. So historically, and the reason we bring this up here, religious figures are incredibly important in this. So whether it be Muslim religious figures saying the name of the Sultan in the Friday prayers, something that, as I'll discuss at the end, often would happen in the Ottoman Empire, for instance. Or whether it be, Christian, certainly the Pope excommunicating a king, which happened on occasion in the medieval empire, in the medieval period, would be the reverse. It would be a delegitimation, something that kings did not want to have happen to them. And of course, religious figures are far from the only people that can alter the beliefs of people. There's local elites of all types, even kind of social elites. All right. So then, the final question. And if you have any training in game theory, you might see how a game is kind of forming here. We have multiple people, we have their interests here. But the one thing we don't have right now is interaction. So what we can then say is, all right, these agents, you don't provide legitimacy or you don't provide coercion for free. You expect something in return, right? So what you expect in return are some say over laws and policies, or moreover, laws and policies that benefit yourself. All right, so we can think of then as the laws and policies that are the outcomes of a society as the outcome of this bargain. And what this bargain and how we should think of a bargain is, you could think of a bargain as in any type of bargain you might come across in your daily life. It could be a sports trade you could think about. You could think about bargaining between two firms. The outcome is going to be a function of how the bargaining position of those people and what they want to get out of the bargain. And what determines the bargaining position of these people are, when we think of legitimating agents or coercive agents, are how effective they are at their jobs. If religious authorities are really good at legitimating a ruler, they're going to be able to ask for a lot, and the ruler's going to cede a lot. All right? So that is the kind of the key concept, of so this is the key concept of the framework. And before I kind of move on to some of the implications of this framework, I have an entire chapter which I'm just going to very briefly describe, explaining why, for very historical reasons, Islam was better at legitimating rule than Christianity. This does not mean that Christianity was incapable of legitimating rule. It very clearly was and still is. But the idea here, and this goes back to relatively large historical literature, that suggests that look, Islam was born along with a growing empire, the Islamic Empire. Muhammad himself was a political leader as well. Within the first 100 years, you have an empire that was nothing, expanding out from Arabia and going as far west as Spain and as far east as South Asia. This was an empire that was in need, certainly of legitimation, and in need of laws that could serve what was a much larger and more diverse group of people than could ever have been imagined prior to the early 7th century. And thus, as Islam is forming, it's forming in and the core kind of corpus of Islamic doctrine is forming in this context. And so you get a lot of doctrine, and I list a number of these in the book, essentially saying that as long as a ruler is acting in accordance with Islam, that ruler should be followed. And if they're not, they should not, it more or less says you have the right to kill the ruler, but more or less the ruler should be disobeyed. Well, who do you think are the people that interpret whether the ruler is acting in accordance with Islam or not? These people. It eventually becomes the religious class, the religious elite. So they have a lot of power here. Because Islam, when I say that there's really no doctrinal difference in the story, the one doctrinal difference that matters between Islam and Christianity, at least for my theory here, is that Islam is better at legitimating rule than Christianity. Because Christianity, on the other hand, was born in the Roman Empire, which is already a well-functioning society that had very steeped political institutions, other means of legitimating rule, whether it be the Roman ideology, the Senate, things like this. In fact, Christians for the first 3 centuries were a minority within the Roman Empire, a persecuted minority at that. Clearly, while Christian doctrine was forming, there was not going to be much in there that really pushed for legitimating rule. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It goes back to Jesus even saying, "Render unto Caesar things that are Caesar's, and render unto God things that are God." Having this idea of a separation between the two, and it's not the church's or the religion's place to enter into the world of what you might think of as the secular. Now, this again doesn't mean that Christianity is never used to legitimate rule. It very obviously is. Anyone who reads anything about the medieval period or like watches Game of Thrones or something knows that that Christianity is very clearly something that can be used to legitimate. But the only idea is that as economists we try to think on the margin is what we say. We try to think, well, what maybe one is more or better at doing something than the other. And that's all this argument is that's all we're discussing here. So now let's think about the implications of this. The implications of this being that Muslim religious authorities have better bargaining power vis-a-vis their rulers. So what we expect, if this framework helps explain anything about the real world or historical phenomena, is that there are going to be laws and policies that favor religious authorities more so in the Islamic world, broadly construed, than in the Christian world. Now, what that means isn't just that rulers are going to put forth policies that it doesn't mean that you get theocracy in one place and non-theocracy in the other. What it means is you're going to get a whole host of, I think, things that are very hard to foresee. So let me just take you to the first one. So I have a few major applications in the book of this theory. Some are more on the micro level, some kind of look at it from a very big macro history level. On a more micro level, the framework helps explain reactions to the spread of the printing press, something that might not be obvious if you don't know much about the history of this, why the framework would have anything to say about this. So very quickly, since I would assume you don't necessarily know everything about the history of the printing press. It's invented around 1450 in Mainz, Germany by Johann Gutenberg. And it very quickly spread throughout Europe. All right, by 1500, most cities have a printing press. Millions of books have been printed. And I think for good reason, it's considered one of, if not the most important inventions of the last millennium, certainly in the West. All right, so to get an idea of what this looks like, by 1500, these are all cities that have printing presses. You can see they're just kind of all over Western Europe. All right. So it still might not be clear where we're getting to using this framework. You'll see in a second. All right. So now thinking about the church's reaction. All right. So the church accepted the press. The church very quickly not just adopted the press, but was one of its biggest proponents. It used it. Now, if you know anything about some of this period of history, you might know that this is quite ironically to print indulgences for something I'll talk about in a second. It did censor a few things, but for the most part, no restrictions lasted long anywhere in Europe for almost any reason. Idea here being, look, the printing press spread quite quickly. So why is this something that we care about, or why is it being addressed by the framework? Well, the printing press did not spread everywhere so fast. Now, one of the most famous, to at least historians and economic historians, kind of failures of technology diffusion, I think in the last millennium, is the stifling of the printing press in the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire, by the 15th century, certainly by the time of the printing press, was kind of the dominant player in the Middle East. In 1453, they conquered Constantinople, and rename it Istanbul, and kind of quickly spread throughout what we will think of as today the modern Middle East. This culminates in 1517 when they conquer the Egyptian Mamluk Empire, and by that point, they've dominated most of this region. Now, what happens with respect to the story we're telling here, the following. The movable press we know was known to the Ottomans as early as the 1480s and possibly before. Pretty soon thereafter, an edict is issued banning printing in the Arabic script. So the Arabic script is both the script of the language Arabic, but also of Ottoman Turkish, which is the language of the Ottomans and which is the language of government. All right. The press was banned for, as far as we know, until 1727, 250 years almost, without one of the most important technologies, really, of the last millennium in the West. And really, and even then, when it's permitted, it's highly regulated. There's no real printing industry really anywhere in the Muslim world. So this isn't just the Ottomans that are doing this. There are some other Muslim empires, especially in South Asia, that are also blocking printing. So nothing really emerges until the 19th century. All right. This seems like a major missed opportunity. Does the framework that I noted before here explain it? Well, the first thing you might think, Arabic is it has a very different, more complex language or system than the Latin script. But this is clearly not the reason. Why do we know this? Well, Europeans figured out how to print the Arabic script quite quickly. There were a lot of Christians living in Middle East, North Africa at this time, and Europeans printed stuff to send to them or to sell to them. So we know that it has nothing to do with that. We also know that the Ottomans permitted printing in other languages and in other scripts. So there were, the Ottoman Empire was this hodgepodge of different, Southeastern Europe was Ottoman, so you have the Greek language, for instance. So if you had a Greek press, you could print. If you had a Hebrew press, you could print. So why would they be interested and concerned with those printing in Arabic? Who benefits? All right? And this is where we get back to the story. Now we're thinking about this story or this framework where you have people bargaining over laws and policies. This is a policy or a law that is prohibiting printing, something that very clearly had massive economic benefits and really could even be used politically too for propaganda purposes, for a whole host of reasons. Who benefits? Religious authorities benefit, which we might be able to backtrack if we're thinking about who's sitting at the bargaining table and who has power. So the reason that they benefit is that in the Ottoman Empire, and like most, probably every pre-modern Muslim-ruled empire, religious authorities really had a monopoly, or a near monopoly, on the transmission of knowledge, and certainly the transmission of religious knowledge, and really kind of all of the types of institutions that came along with that, and the benefits that came along with that. So they were able to impose these huge barriers to entry into the religious establishment and all of the benefits, including being the major jurists of the empire that came along with it. By making in order to be a qualified jurist, you had to really know a lot of the basic documents of Islam by heart. You had to be able to interpret them and travel to different places to show that you were qualified. Well, the printing press definitely would have threatened this. It would have made access to knowledge much less expensive. And as an aside, this is what happens in Europe, as I'll note in a second here. So these guys weren't wrong to be scared by the printing press, because this is threatening. It's not just that it threatens their monopoly on the intellectual output of the region, but this is the precise reason that they have power in the first place, is they are the only ones that are qualified to interpret Islamic doctrine. And that's a really important thing, both for the legitimacy of the ruler, but also even for jurisprudence, for Islamic law. All right, so you say, all right, well, religious authorities were threatened by this, sure, but they're not going to be the ones that are able to ban a printing press. They have no coercive power. They can't. They're not going to go out in the streets and start smashing up printing presses. They need the people with guns to do this for them, or not guns at the time, but All right. So the question is, why would the Sultan do this? And now, hopefully, if you've thought about it, and especially in the context of the framework I proposed here, it should be fairly straightforward. Why would the Sultan suppress such an obviously beneficial technology? Well, the answer is religious authorities in particular were a key source of political propagation, namely through the way that they legitimated rule. All right, and the Ottomans in particular, probably more than almost any other Muslim empire in world history, were in particular need of religious legitimation, in large part because they ruled over, and certainly after 1517, they ruled over Mecca and Medina. They ruled over these extremely important religious areas, yet they did not have the internal qualifications that are generally needed to be considered appropriate Muslim rulers. They weren't Arab, and they had no bloodline at all to Muhammad. They were Central Asian. They were Turks. So getting the religious establishment on their side was extremely important for this kind of what we might think of as the grand bargain, because the religious authorities were able to legitimate their rule in a way that no other part of society would have been able to do. All right, and I mentioned this at the very beginning. They did this in a number of ways. One kind of very well-known way is the Friday sermons, especially around the capital, but even in some of the provincial capitals. The major sermons, the major ulama, the jurists would mention the name of the Sultan, to kind of associate the Sultan with this aura of religiosity. All right. So this is part of the bargain, and it's part of the bargain that the Sultan has no desire to see the religious establishment undermined. Right? That's one of their key sources of legitimacy. If the religious establishment goes away, if the access to religious legitimacy goes away, they don't have much. They're in trouble. All right. So that's a cool story. Doesn't matter. Maybe. I'm going to argue it does. All right, does the printing press matter economically or politically? Because I do want to get to the subtitle of the book here, why the West got rich and the Middle East did not. I'm not claiming it's printing, all right? I am going to claim, though, as we'll see in a second here, that there were some very unforeseeable consequences of the printing press that you really have to track down the history here and take one step to one step to one step to one step to start to understand how these things might have affected and contributed to the divergence, the economic divergence between the two regions. All right. So some recent work by economic historians does suggest that there's a direct link between the printing press and economic growth. That's fine. I'm here to suggest that there is an indirect path between the printing press and the long-run economic and particularly political changes that happened in Europe at the time, that for precisely these reasons that we just discussed were not happening in the Middle East. So namely, do these guys, these old-timey printers, lead to the success of this guy, Martin Luther. So the next connection we'll make is, all right, now you have this information technology that has spread throughout Europe, and it takes about 50 years, because this is about the time frame that stuff spreads in this period, and also, it's a pretty expensive technology. But by 1500, it's spread through Europe. Very soon after, the real first threat to the church succeeds, and it succeeds enormously. Can we connect the two and make a causal argument? So the Reformation, very brief background here, begins in 1517 again, and this is not that long after the press really spread. So the press is invented in 1450. It takes a while for it to spread. So soon after it spreads, the Reformation kicks off. We just had the 500-year anniversary last year of the Reformation. And it kind of fundamentally threatens the church. By 1530, the church has been kicked out of numerous parts of Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, which more or less parts of modern-day Germany, Scandinavia, parts of France, Switzerland. It eventually comes to England and the Dutch Republic, and I highlight those here in part because this is where the modern economy emerges. And what I'm going to say now is that this is not a coincidence. Now, I also need to be clear that this has nothing to do with the greatness of Protestant doctrine either. To the extent that any of you have heard of, say, Weber's Protestant ethic hypothesis, has nothing to do with that either. What I am going to argue, though, is that the political economy, the politics of these Protestant regions were different for reasons that have to do with the way we're thinking about the model here, or this framework here. All right, so first, before I even get to that, so let's make this causal connection, because on the one hand, you can say, all right, well, the printing press spread and then you have the Reformation, yeah, they're connected, but that's something you have to show. All right, so is it true? Did one thing cause the other? So here's a quote. The printing press is God's highest and ultimate gift of grace by which he would have his gospel carried forward. So this is somebody that does think the printing press is pretty important. It's Martin Luther himself. So suggesting, again, that even on the ground, at the time, this isn't something that with the benefit of hindsight we've been able to see as being important. At the time, they thought it was important. Why? Well, the press allows for the spread. I mean, it's really a propaganda thing, for the most part. It's not just propaganda, it's spreading of ideas, because Martin Luther was prolific. He wrote thousands of pamphlets over the course of his career. What we also know is that he was inspired, and his followers were inspired by very similar ideas that spread throughout Europe in the centuries prior. So most famously would be, say, Jan Hus in Bohemia, modern day, say, Czech Republic or so, that had these guys were railing against the church, including Luther, for being greedy, for printing indulgences, where essentially a get out of hell free card. And they thought the church was this kind of institution that had gotten way far away from its original intent. Previous ones were very easily suppressed, or at least they were suppressed before they got out of hand. This is Jan Hus burning at the stake. The key difference here that I'm arguing, and others have argued as well, I'm about the 1,000th person that has made this claim, but I'm really the first to take real data to it, is that Luther had the press. And what did he use the press for? And it's not just him, of course, it's him and his followers. Mainly to spread pamphlets on the one hand. They wrote thousands of pamphlets. They were generally about 8 pages, and they'd be reprinted. So if you were near a printing press, that really mattered for your ability to access the newest propaganda, or the newest railings against the church. And they were often combined with broadsheets, because now you might be thinking, all right, well, most people didn't know how to read, so why would these be effective? Well, for two reasons. One is that they were generally read aloud in public spaces. This was a time when people would generally congregate in public spaces, and this would be a common thing. The second is that they were often combined with broadsheets, and broadsheets were generally maybe wood carvings or some type of print, but then printed type of carving that was generally very graphic and very obvious. And even the most uneducated of peasant would have been immersed enough in the type of symbolism to understand it. So this is a very clear one, for instance. You can find this on Wikipedia. This is Martin Luther putting up his 95 Theses, and you can see the quill of his pen going through the head of a lion, who the Pope at this time was named Leo, and you can see Leo up here, Leo X. So this is his quill going piercing the skull of a lion. This is a very vivid. And these things were something like this would have been unthinkable prior to the Reformation, because you would have been in trouble had you been putting around something like this. And these guys did get in trouble. A lot of Protestants died, and eventually a lot of Catholics too, in these wars between each other. But this is something that once the movement began, the press helped it go quick enough so that by the time they were really able to kind of counter it, it had spread too fast and become too entrenched. All right. So again, whether so this is kind of an aside. But this is This is something that's testable. So everything here suggests, and this is the historiography of the Reformation. Sure, we have this technology that allows us to spread information real quick. You also have this movement that is facilitated by the spread of information. Does one thing cause the other? Well, just because you can make the story doesn't mean that one thing actually caused the other. It could just be the case that cities that were most likely to adopt the Reformation for completely different reasons were also likely to have a press. So this is testable, and I collected a ton of data. I spent 2 years of my life putting together and analyzing these data for 9 pages of the book, so that was a fun 2 years. But I do have some cool pictures, I think. So this is one just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on in Europe at this time. In terms of these are actually almost the universe of even remotely decently sized cities in Europe as of 1600. And so circles are those with presses, and the more darkly shaded ones are the ones that adopted the Reformation. You can see a lot in Central Europe and up and eventually in the Low Countries, mainly the Dutch Republic. And the main finding here is, if you're a student, you can look at the bottom thing. If you're not, look at the top thing. The cities that with printing presses were all else equal 29 percentage points more likely to adopt the Reformation. That's a big effect. That means that that essentially means that a lot of what we can think of, it's not the only thing, but a lot of what we can attribute to the success of the Reformation comes from the printing press. Of course, it's not the only thing. No one would claim an event like the Reformation as monocausal. But it's also hard to think, what the counterfactual is. If you don't have the printing press, does the Reformation succeed? Probably not. All right. So we're still not there by any means yet getting at the subtitle of the book, Why the West Got Rich. The Middle East did not. Now we're getting there, though. Because now I'm going to argue the Reformation was very key to answering the question in the subtitle. Not because of any particular Protestant doctrine, but because what it did was it provided the death knell to the church, the institutionalized church, even though obviously Protestant churches replaced the church, but the church as itself was this really important legitimating institution, even though, again, it was less important than the Middle East. When you demolish that, you can think of, and I'll talk about this very briefly in a bit, Henry VIII, what he does, he kicks out the church. He confiscates the wealth of the monasteries. Well, that's a really important player in this system that you are eliminating. You've got to replace them with somebody, right? You can't just if you're depending at least a little bit on religious legitimacy. All right, what do? Who else do you rely on for legitimacy? All right. So that's the question that needs to be answered, and I propose that the answer to this question is the key to one of the keys to understanding the question proposed in the subtitle of the book. So to whom did they turn? And the answer, for the most part, are the economic elite. They turn to parliaments. parliaments had been there. So parliaments generally consisted, to some extent, of religious figures, but largely of the landed elite, and eventually, by the 13th and 14th centuries, the urban elite. So the people that were engaged in commerce, whether they be in guilds or merchants or things like this. All right. Now, the reason you could turn to parliaments as a source of legitimacy was really kind of twofold. For one, they had been providing some type of law, some type of pushback prior to the Reformation in these places, because they were where the elites congregated. But they generally did not have a ton of power vis-a-vis the crown prior to 1517, but really prior to 1500. And the main reason they didn't have a ton of power is the crown didn't need them. Kings and queens did not, they negotiated with parliaments when they needed some money, but they generally had decent access to funds. They had to some extent religious legitimacy. And this is also prior to the period where wars are extremely expensive to fight. So they aren't in constant need of funds. So they don't need parliaments. Now, one of their legs has been kicked out. They don't have religious legitimacy, so they turn to parliament. Meaning that, again, if we're thinking about this in terms of that framework, the members of, and really the people that parliaments are supporting or representing are getting a lot more power. Bargaining power vis-a-vis the crown, because now you have one of the main elements not having bargaining power. So again, they were generally consisted of 3 estates. Now clergy became less important, even though not of zero importance, and in places that adopted the Reformation, after the Reformation. Besides, that was mainly the landed nobility and the urban elite. Increasingly over time, these people did have more commercial interests, especially as overseas trade expands, and even the landed elites start investing in overseas trade. And clearly the urban elite, what we might think of as really the economic elite, have interest in economic power. So what this really does then is it transfers who has political power more towards those with commercial interests, interested in commerce. In the book I call the economic elite, but really it's a hodgepodge of people with various interests that have an interest in commerce. Now the key thing here, now I want to also preface this by saying, I'm not just saying give all your political power to the economic elite and everything will be great. That's definitely not the case. What I am saying, what I will go on record as saying though, and I guess this is being taped, is that if the commercial elite or the economic elite have zero economic power, that's also not good. Because what do they want? And think about, what did the religious elite want? It's not that the religious elite always actually necessarily, like the case of the printing press, want things that are bad for growth, for economic growth. In fact, sometimes they want things that are good. So I think the best example of this is poor relief. Both Islam and Christianity, and generally we think of religion in general, looking after the poor is a huge thing. And oftentimes, in fact, certainly in the West, the church was a major provider of poor relief. So this is an example of and it's also something I think that generally is consistent with economic growth, having that social safety net. On the other hand, their interests aren't necessarily the things that are great for economic growth either. They're generally even just kind of orthogonal or tangential to economic growth. On the other hand, the commercial elite, for their own personal self-interested reasons, not because they want to see everyone rise up, they want actually, well, the one thing they want, the biggest thing they want is the big prize, stuff like property rights, and not for everyone, just for themselves. They want their stuff to be somewhat free from confiscation. As we see when looking at these histories, another big thing they want are investments in certain types of public goods, like especially when you're talking about trade expanding, like transportation networks, the type of infrastructure that supports trade, things like this, are generally what we might think of as things that take massive investment and often require government investment to really do well. So an example that I point to in the book is to say the Dutch, the Netherlands is mostly under sea level. Well, in this period after the Reformation, a lot of it is brought back from underwater, which is a massive undertaking. Dredging the sea. Well, this is something that once people that gain from that, themselves are in power, that's something that they do. They also start overseas trade companies, things that also take a lot of investment. All right. So again, it's not that these guys, and you don't want necessarily these people running the country. And they also want plenty of things that are bad for economic development. Like they want monopolies for themselves and their friends, right? Which is not good for economic development. But overall, they do want the big things. If we think of a list, if you asked a lot of economic historians, what are the 5 things you need for economic development, they probably want 2 or 3 of those things. And so that's much better than not having those things. All right? And so this is just an argument, or a quick figure to show you that after the Reformation, which happens right here, places that eventually adopted the Reformation have a lot, their parliaments are much more active. Again, all this suggests is that parliaments in these places really did grow, and they really did become much more important. All right? So I'm going to take you through 2 applications, because one, I want you, to see the European side, and then I want you to see what happens in the counter. So I've kind of been now pushing back the Middle East. We haven't talked about the Middle East for a little bit. But remember the whole printing press story, you backtrack. All right, you have a religious establishment that is not being threatened. They have their access to, their intellectual monopoly, their place in society is strong. They're not, and there are challenges to the Ottoman religious establishment, and there's no real religious establishment. Should be clear as an aside, but there are challenges to it. But because they're so important in this this legitimating arrangement with the rulers, the Ottoman sultans, they remain strong throughout this entire period. And what does not happen is that what we might think of as the economic elite or the commercial elite, they almost get zero say in the laws and policies of Ottoman society. Okay? And that's what I think is important when we think about why one society succeeds and the other doesn't. But let's just take you on a very quick journey through some of this history. So in England, prior to the Reformation, the church is, it's not the only player in society. Even members of parliament were important, the landed elite particularly, but they did play a big role. They were the biggest landowner. There were plenty of people in the House of Lords that were major, that were bishops and things like this. In the 1530s, Henry VIII, for perhaps his own idiosyncratic reasons or for political reasons, brings the Reformation to England. He confiscates all the wealth of the monasteries. The Catholic Church is more or less done at this point, even though it comes back a little bit here and there, but let's not worry about that. What the key here, the key thing that happens, and eventually happens under Elizabeth, his daughter, who comes to power in 1558, and kind of starts formalizing the Reformation, is that it alters the basis for political legitimacy. Now, Parliament throughout this period, throughout the Tudor period, beginning really, and even prior to the Reformation, but certainly after the Reformation, plays a much greater role in English politics, and really is able to push laws, the types of laws and policies that I think it's kind of unimaginable that pre-Reformation and certainly pre-Henry VIII monarchs would have permitted. So again, the upshot here is a major voice. We'll call them property holders, but it's not just property holders. It's people with interests in all types of commercial ventures. And again, starting in the 17th century, when access to the New World opens up, and not just the New World, but all types of overseas commerce. This becomes, the type of people involved in these ventures get a much greater political voice as well. And again, this all can be traced back to the crown, the English crown, kind of needing to negotiate with these people because they have no other way of holding on to power. All right, so you get hundreds of bills that are concerning things that Parliament had never been interested in before. Not maybe they were interested in, but they weren't able to do anything about before. And a large part of this is that they had new power to create these laws. They're laws that the crown is going to accede to. Whereas the crown my reading of it is almost certainly would not have permitted at least a number of these laws to pass previously because the crown didn't need to negotiate with Parliament. In fact, Parliament only met when the crown allowed it to. All right. Now, eventually, if you know the history of England, 17th century gets a little bloody and you get conflict between Parliament and the Crown as the Stuarts try to pull back some of what they did. But what's really going on here is that prior to these conflicts, Parliament is becoming much stronger. And that's really important because it's not just that it's parliament, it's that it's who parliament represents and even who is in parliament themselves and people of those social classes. So I did have some stuff, so we're running a little low on time, on the Dutch Republic and Spain as well. So maybe I will say just a quick word about that before I talk about the Ottoman Empire. Because one thing that I think is, I wrote the book, but so I think is nice about the book is that it applies not just to Europe versus the Middle East, but it even helps explain why a part of Europe became where the modern economy grew. Because if you look at Spain, I think Spain's kind of almost the classic case of the place that as of even as late as 1500, they're starting to look really good. They're the ones that are certainly finding tons of riches in the New World. They're at the center, especially the Habsburg kings of the 16th century, at the center of a lot of the political conflict of Europe. And they're a major political player. But what happens, and I'll just show you this, I think these are Spanish real wages. And this isn't totally unique to Spain over this period. This is 1300 to 1850, and these are real wages, mind you, so we can kind of compare them over time. Look at that. They're declining. So a Spaniard, even if you take the little uptick in 1850, the average Spaniard is poor. And you can even talk about, before the Black Death, 500 years, so poorer than the average Spaniard 500 years prior. And part of the explanation here is that the Spaniards were, the Catholic monarchs. They're the ones that held on to religious legitimacy more so than anyone else. This goes back, and Spain has a very unique history that can help explain this. As you might have seen on the first few slides, there's a long history of Muslim rule in Spain, and then there's the Catholic reconquest of Spain, which meant that religion played a somewhat unique role. And because of this, the Spanish crown never had to negotiate with their parliaments. They did have parliaments, the Cortes, which they almost never really ceded anything to in this period. So wealth holders, the economic elite, had very little say in politics. Very similar story, for slightly different reasons, in the Ottoman Empire. All right, so as I noted before, the major players here are the religious establishment. The military elite are also really important. I'm not going to go into that as much here because it's running low on time, but also it's not as important for the story here. But what this does mean, though, is that when we're thinking about it in terms of the framework, is that having this access to religious legitimacy, and as well as tax revenue, mainly coming from the military elite, who were given tax farms in the various provinces, allowed them to stay in power, which is what we're thinking of as their main goal, without bargaining with the economic elite. The economic elite were not brought to the table. And we know that there were economic elite. There definitely were. Istanbul is one of the most commercially cosmopolitan cities in the world under the Ottoman Empire. There were certainly economic elite in the Ottoman Empire, but they have very little political power. And what this means is that all of the actions taken by the sultans are they're not necessarily anti-economic. I mean, they do have incentive, the sultans, to put forth policies that benefit the economy, but not at the expense of, say, giving the big prize. If you're a ruler and you want to be an autocrat, like I think most rulers probably would be, you don't want to give up property rights if you don't have to. You want to give up other things. Yeah, sure. I'll fund some of your little missions somewhere, but I'm going to be able to confiscate your wealth if I need it. All right. So what they do instead of bargaining with their commercial elite is they give their religious elite a pretty big say at the bargaining table. And remember, when we're thinking about what the outcome is of these bargains, the big outcome are laws and policies that favor the agents with a lot of bargaining power. Now, one thing that the religious establishment, by the Ottoman period you can call it a religious establishment, certainly bargained for was access to, or rather, the continued use of Islamic law over commercial issues. So Islamic law is a whole host of doctrine concerning commercial issues. And this was also true of medieval canon law. Canon law, religious law was used on a whole host of issues, even some economic issues. But Europe, as religious legitimacy became less important, moved away from this. This is something that religious authorities did not want to give up. And so there's no reason for the sultans to give them up. So as a consequence here, they don't have to negotiate, the sultans, with the moneyed elite, with the economic elite. Nothing like parliaments ever form prior to, say, the late 19th century in any part of the world. And this is only after the Ottoman Empire has fallen very clearly, even by their own admission, fallen well behind. All right, so there's a whole host of things you can look at that would suggest that there are consequences to this. So you have, again, the capacity to accumulate capital would be one of those things that I think a lot of economists, capital accumulation would be a big thing on the list of things you need for a successful economy. There were major restrictions placed, for reasons that it threatened the prevailing order. Very highly uncertain property rights. There are plenty of cases of sultans going back on rights that are given. Justice is highly partial. We think of as not so great. There's a lot of negative consequences, especially to commerce, that happened because, as I argue in large part, because commercial elites had no seat at the political bargaining table. All right, so in conclusion, again, so I want to more so kind of raise caveats than anything else. This argument, even though religion is at its core, it's about the role religion plays in politics, not about religion itself, except you could say, well, except the role that religion, the religious doctrine of Islam and Christianity is different with respect to legitimating rule. But besides that, everything else, it's, Christianity and Islam are way closer on most things than they are different. All right. I also want to be very clear. This is not at all a deterministic story. It's not like it had to happen this way. It's not like the ball got set rolling in motion and the West was going to become rich and the Middle East was not. In fact, I think I kept on using these terms: unintended, unforeseeable consequences. These are things that were by no means had to happen the way they happened. But what we can say as kind of economists or economic historians is, as one thing happens and then the next thing happens, then the next thing might be more likely to happen. And certainly economic growth is more likely to happen when you have what I call economic agents at the political bargaining table. And finally, I want to be clear, this is not about, say, all right, let's just transplant what happened in England to everywhere in the world and we'll get economic growth. That's definitely not the case. What happened in England happened in a certain set of cultural circumstances, in a certain set of economic circumstances that are different than anything faced in the world today or faced back then. Now, what we can learn, it doesn't mean we don't want to learn anything from the story, but what it does mean is that just transplanting the type of institutions that worked in one place doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get what happened in the other. But we also can say what didn't work in certain parts of the world is also very unlikely to work today. So again, we do want to understand where modern wealth comes from, not just for historical reasons, but to really get an idea of some of the things that might work. And then from there, I'll leave it to the development economists, I suppose. So thank you.
All right, so thank you, Jared. So now we're going to go to the question and answer part of the evening. So we'll have you raise your hands and I'll identify you. The one caveat is you should have a question that ends with a question mark. So, and it shouldn't have a bunch of sentences before that. So we'll start there and so right here.
Thank you very much. One thing that I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, is that part of the reluctance in the Islamic world to adopt the printing press had to do with the significance of calligraphy, like economically. There were a lot of calligraphy was much more important. The Arabs than the Christians, I guess. And the other thing I was wondering if there was any truth to that, you thought. And the other thing I was wondering is why a state monopoly of a printing press wouldn't have been just as good or better than banning it, since provided it was controlled.
Sure. So, I think to answer the first question, I think there certainly are these features of the society at the time, the culture of the time, not just that it affected the religious authorities in one way. Said I think it's kind of hard to say that this is the primary reason, namely calligraphy, is being important. In large part, for multiple reasons. For one, I think the fact that other types of presses weren't banned is one thing. That kind of doesn't necessarily coincide with this argument. But moreover, the early presses in Europe displaced, largely, it actually took about a century to displace the manuscripts that were written mainly by monks or whatever. And the early printed work was beautiful. It looked like almost calligraphy for the most part. So there's no necessarily real reason. I mean, that I actually, so my own take on it would be that the calligraphy story was more of a public relations type story for why one would ban it, because, and there's also similar issues with just the reproduction of images, which was something that is looked down upon in Islam that more easily could have been done with a press. But again, these just looking at this does not explain a lot of the aspects. Sorry, the second question. The state monopoly.
I think you partly answered that.
Yeah. So I think that that this is something that in terms of, so the question again was, why couldn't you just have a state monopoly and have it tightly controlled? I think that this is something that it was such a fundamental threat, and frankly, they were. I imagine they must have been seeing what was happening in Europe at the time, that you can control large aspects of it, but once the cat's out of the bag, it's really hard to put it back in. And the printing press represented, I think, such a fundamental threat, certainly to the religious establishment, but also, these were rulers that at the time. Well, so soon after, the ban is kind of one of the peaks of the Ottoman period. So it's not necessarily clear that, say Suleiman the Great would have been too worried about being overthrown, but a number of his followers were overthrown, were killed, and would have certainly been worried about letting any type of cat out of the bag. So I think that it's a possible alternative, sure, but I think from a cost-benefit perspective, I can at least see why the cost would still be too high.
I think we see today that China's running this experiment,
Yeah.
so I guess we can just wait a little while and see how that
Yeah,
works. So I think you had your hand up over here. Oh, here, sorry, yes.
In some ways, this is a counter story to Guns, Germs, and Steel.
By the other Jared.
What?
The other Jared.
And I'm just wondering whether you grappled with that in your book, or
Yeah.
would carry through now, or maybe the
Yeah.
two stories are not necessarily.
So I do. So in the first chapter, I have a section, it's something like 10 to 15 pages on what I call alternative and complementary hypotheses. So I put Diamond's argument broadly in what we would call like a geographic, so geography is really important for him, the east-west, plans Eurasia versus the north-south, the Americas, certain types of domesticatable plants and animals, things like this. These are stories that I view as, in a sense, almost orthogonal in that they both can account for a lot. And I don't go through any pains in my book to say why I think that's wrong. There are aspects of what we'll call just the more general geography hypotheses that certain aspects of the geographic layout have a long-run determinism that might work through some of what I'm proposing here, namely to the effect that they might have affected the types of religion or the types of politics of, say, the early Islamic empires, which did kind of expand along these routes. And there is evidence that some of the success of the early Islamic empires was in part due to the expansion of different types of animals that would be able to spread, which is kind of more consistent with the type of stuff Diamond would say. But on the other hand, where I think Diamond is the weakest, and I like that book a lot. I think that, and I am also, I should just make it clear, I'm saying that this is a small slice of the pie, too, for even answering the very specific question in the subtitle. Where I think Diamond's a little weaker is getting at, so he's very good at saying stuff that is almost determinate, that, certain type of geographical features, and connecting it to long-run events. Where he's a little weaker is what happens along the way, and particularly at kind of what we might think of as key points in time in the parts of the world, at least I'm concerned with here. And I think he doesn't have a ton to say that, at least I find convincing, on the role of politics, say, in long-run economic development, even though I think that and as we're increasingly seeing, I think, the modern world, that ignoring politics and where we get where societies get their laws from can be somewhat foolish. So I think that, to answer your question, it's a very good question, and Diamond is far from the only one I grapple with in this section. I probably spent more time thinking about this entire section than anything else in the book, because you kind of have to when you write a book like this, you kind of have to place your own thought in what's already out there, and Diamond's clearly one of the major theories on why certain parts of the world grew wealthy, especially after, say, 1500. But I'd like to think of it more as an addition, more so than anything, because I think the role that religion, the role that politics play, and their intersection is clearly important, and Diamond just doesn't say much about it.
Yes, right here.
How's a tweet like like a printing press?
How is a tweet like a printing press? Well, it certainly allows our president to say a lot of things fast. Twitter, so Twitter is something that I actually do bring up very briefly at one point, because when I was first started to write this book in 2010, and the Arab Spring happened soon thereafter, and there are a lot of similarities between what was happening at the time of the Arab Spring and what was happening at the Reformation. Obviously, tweets and Facebook posts and things happen at a exponentially faster rate than the printed word could be spread. But in terms of what we'll call just more generally information communication technologies, there's the connection between that and massive movements against what were previously might have thought of as you might have thought as almost unassailable institutions, whether they be, in the case of the Arab Spring, say political, for the most part, institutions that were highly repressive. And I won't comment on the aftermath of the Arab Spring, because that's a very different question. But in terms of the connection between that, I think it's actually a somewhat fair comparison. That when we're, and I think that more broadly, the internet today is the 20th and 21st century equivalent of the printing press to the 15th century, in terms of really allowing a whole host of things, including propaganda, of course, but also just information to spread much more quickly, and thus allowing movements like that to succeed before they can be suppressed.
Yeah. And then the other question I asked, you brought up property.
Mm-hmm.
That was the key.
Yeah.
Like our modern day housing crisis.
So I don't necessarily mean property in terms of how, real estate is one aspect of property. When we talk about property rights, and maybe this is something I did gloss over a little too quickly, I think property rights, we more think of the freedom from arbitrary confiscation of our property, whether it be, our real estate, or, much more likely, our liquid wealth, things like this, which, in plenty parts of the world today, property rights are relatively insecure, increasingly in parts of the developing world, and this is something that is on that list that I think a lot of economists at least would agree that is really important. At least knowing that that there's some type of laws out there, and that the laws specify whose property is whose based on registries or whatever, and that if it's your property, whether it be the stuff you own on you right now, the stuff at your house or your house itself, that's yours, that it can't be confiscated for other reasons. So that's what I meant. Not so much the concept of property, but the rights to property and the rights to freedom from confiscation of that property. And that's something that most parts of the world do not have, in at least for much of their population, until many parts of the world, the 20th century, but certainly in other parts of Europe, say the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries.
So it's a fundamental power to have property.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Question over here. Yeah, please go ahead.
Would you talk a little bit about how the access to business loans or money for investment in businesses, how that may have helped the West get rich.
Yeah. So do you have anything in mind? Or yeah, I mean, I can talk a lot about that.
I had always heard that in Islam there were rules about the loaning of money and charging of interest,
Yes.
and that may have made it less appealing to loan money, and
So-
then there's less money to invest in business.
Yes. So I was assuming that's where you're going. So chapter 4 of the book is about bans on interest, because interest was banned in Christianity for over a millennium. It wasn't formally banned in the New Testament, even though there are some parts of Deuteronomy that ban it for young. It's actually just telling Jews not to lend at interest to fellow Jews. And starting about the 13th century or so, those bans start being relaxed. So, in fact, much of my dissertation work, now done a long time ago, was on this question precisely, and I view it more as a microcosm of exactly what's going on here in this framework that I've proposed in this book. Because what you start to see is that as religious elite start to lose power in Europe, political power, and commercial elite even start to gain a modicum of power, these are among the first things to go, are the usury. It's called usury in historically, but really a usury law is, and historically it's any interest was banned. They're the first things to go, and what you immediately get are these secular laws that cap interest. We still have those today. It goes state by state in the U.S. today. In the Islamic world, it is true. In the Quran, there are admonitions against taking what's known as riba, which is there's dispute over exactly what that means, but some have interpreted it to mean any interest at all. Very quickly in the Islamic world, people found ways to get around that. And these were condoned by religious authorities who realized they needed to be somewhat practical. So one way to get around it would be like for me to sell this water bottle to you for $5, and you buy it back from me in 1 year for $6. It's a 20% loan for $5. But it's legal because it's 2 sales, both of which are legal. That's a very simple way of doing it. It does mean, though, that there are a lot of these kind of stratagems to get around loans. But what it does mean is that as you get more complex, you have to come up with more complex, because this would work fine for a small loan, especially if we knew each other. But if there was, kind of a hint that we were trying to really evade the ban, I would have a very hard time taking you to court or suing you, because it would be too clear that we were trying to evade the ban. So in terms of what you might think of as like setting up, not even a bank, but even something that, where your kind of full-time profession is lending at some and expecting some type of return, there are going to be major costs associated with that are not prevalent when you can just freely lend at interest. So one thing I do note is that I don't want to, kind of full on make this claim, because I think there's a lot of reasons why this happened. But one thing you don't get in the Middle East until the mid-19th century are banks. Then the first bank in the Middle East is a European-owned bank that comes in. And this is very clearly a large part of the reason is that the open lending of interest is something that is still forbidden today. And so to the extent you know anything about Islamic banking today, this is banking that uses these type of ways of getting, there's ostensibly just like the banks we know, except one of the main things they do is they don't formally lend at interest. They use ways to get around it. I definitely think that this meant had a whole host of implications, and they're kind of hard to tease out in a sense, because you have to think down the road what this means for things like investment. We know it clearly didn't stifle merchant activity. There was plenty of merchant activity in the Middle East, but the counterfactual of what would have happened had permitting moderate interest on loans been perfectly legal, it's one that is enticing to think that that it probably played some role. And I think a key point here, though, is all of this does go back to kind of this more underlying political economy framework is the reason why you don't have the alleviation of these bans like you do in Europe.
Any more questions?
About your model, do you think it's easier for states to gain legitimacy through legitimizing agents or coercive ones?
It matters in a sense. So the question I couldn't hear was, do you think it's easier for states to get kind of stay in power, rulers stay in power through legitimating or coercive agents. And the reason I say it matters is, and this is actually a very key part of the framework, is it matters how effective those agents are. So if you have a state, or if you have it's about your society and your history, and what it matters. That's kind of what it matters. If you don't really have people in your society for some historical reason or another that are very good at providing legitimacy, then you're probably going to rely on coercive power, and vice versa. If maybe the technology or the monitoring capacity, or the capacity to get information on people is very weak, and you don't have the technology to know, and which is actually kind of true of most of history. So most of history, it's actually kind of hard to use just pure coercive power because the technology is just not good enough to really coerce people. I mean, you think like the huge Chinese empire, for example. You have no idea what's going on, even 50 miles away from the capital. It's just too expensive, and so you have to rely on the Chinese rely on the bureaucrats who have all this legitimacy because they pass the exams, and that's in Chinese society. That's one of the a big mark of being successful. So yeah, again, the answer is it matters, but that's where studying history, I think, really helps us understand how our societies not just formed and got to the point they are today, but why they currently are the way they are today, and what they could be in the future as well.
All right, well, I think we should wrap it up there, and thank Jared again.
Thank you all.